Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the webinar this morning. A little bit different. I'm sure we'd all rather be in the field looking at the crops for ourselves, but as I'm sure all of you are well aware, we're having to go very differently about things this year. So lovely today. We have our RL team with us, and we're going to have a look through the ultimate guide to the wheat recommended list. So if Mark, please, would you skip on to the next slide, and we'll just quickly run through housekeeping as always. You're all on mute today and your cameras are switched off, so you just have us to look at. If you do have any questions, please pop them in your chat box, which is on the right hand side. Hopefully we'll get round to answering most of them either during the webinar or there is allocated time at the end. If not, we'll do our best to get back in touch with you later on. This webinar is due to finish at approximately 10 o'clock, so it's an hour long basis. And well, I say fingers crossed, Naroso points, they have been on furlough. I think they've all come back to work, so still to be confirmed, but the points are available, which same again, if you could put your details in the chat box on the right hand side, we can then collate those and send off for them. This webinar, as all of our webinars, is being recorded and will be available on our AHDB YouTube channel. Should you miss it today or like to look back over it again, please do have a look. It will be there. And like everything AHDB, we are on Twitter. Please follow us _cereals or #monitorfarm to follow through what the Farm Excellence Programme is doing. Just regard your basis and Naroso points. If the details on the right hand side, if you could put your account number or membership number, date of birth and postcode as well, so that the details are all there, that would be great. Thank you very much. And then to put some names to faces, Paul unfortunately can't be with us this morning. He's introduced himself with a video that we'll look at shortly, but we've got Catherine Harries with us, Mark Bollebacker and Ellie Marshall also. So between them, we'll talk through the recommended list, but like I say, any questions, please keep popping them in the chat box and we'll have a look at them. So without further ado, I will pass over to Paul and his video, and we will introduce you to this webinar today.
My name is Paul Gothing and I'm responsible for the Recommended List programme at the AHDB. The Recommended List programme is the largest piece of work that AHDB does. As a consequence, we have a large group of people that work on the recommended lists. A technical or field team are responsible for procuring, inspecting and then ultimately deciding if a trial is fit for purpose. They see the trials throughout the year and as a consequence have a wealth of knowledge about how the trials and the varieties perform. The other team are the data team. They work in the office mostly and they crunch the numbers that come out of the trials. They also are responsible for producing the publications you see. You'll hear from both these teams later in the webinar. The other part of the jigsaw that makes up the RL are the crop committees. These crop committees, made up of breeders, growers, agronomists and trade representatives such as the maltsters and the millers, are ultimately responsible for recommending varieties. They're also responsible for deciding on what categories varieties should be judged. The lists themselves are old. They go back around 70 years and they've changed a lot over that period, as you'd imagine. If we look back at a 1975 list, for instance, you'll see first of all that there's only a single page of data on each of the crops. There was also a significant limitation on the statistics available in those days, meaning that you could only compare a test variety with a control. You couldn't legitimately compare two test varieties, which is a big limitation. The other big change in 1975 has been the inclusion of the oilseed lists. And it's not only the lists themselves, also the comms have changed. The advent of the internet has enabled us to put the lists into a digital format and make them available to everyone all the time. And it's not just the lists. Behind the lists, it's the trial results, and you can find those on our website. You can also find the protocols by which we run the trials if you really want to see those. If you want to find the results of your local trial as soon as we do, you can sign up to our Harvest Results service, and you'll hear more about that later in the webinar. However, all this extra information isn't a positive thing for everyone. We sometimes hear that the lists are too long and that there's too much data. However, all the varieties are there on merit. We don't want to start restricting the list length on a purely arbitrary basis. However, the data we can do something about. Last year, in December, we released the first of our variety selection tools. These tools enable you to select down and hone in on the varieties that really suit your situation. They're available on our website and the RL part. The first one released was on winter wheat, and over the last few months we've released variety selection tools on all the other cereals. Eventually we'll also have oilseed rape. The other main development of the RL recently has been the advent of the RL app. This was released just last week. We were very excited by it, we think it's very good, and you'll hear a lot about it later in the webinar. So the recommended list has developed quite a lot over the last year, with a big shift towards digital. The recommended list is always looking how it can evolve, to become better, become more useful to levy payers, become faster, or be done more cheaply. It's always evolving. However, there are parts of the recommended list that will never change. Key one of these is its independence. For while AHDB manages the list and the breeders put a lot of resources into the list, producing the data that helps us produce the list, it actually is down to growers, agronomists and the trade representatives to actually select the varieties that are recommended.
Thank you very much, Paul, for that. I'm sure, like many people working from home, it's always a challenge to keep the children quiet while you're trying to piece those videos together. So without further ado, and to take that into further detail, I'm going to hand over to Mark, who's going to give his 2020 winter wheat update. Thank you.
So good morning, my name is Mark Bollebakker. I'm Field Trial Senior Manager at AHDB. Together with two of my colleagues, I'm responsible for the technical management of the RL trials, which involves anything from tendering the trials, organizing the seed, inspecting all the trials and validating all the data from the trials. We're also the official inspectors for all the statutory VCU trials, so all the NL trials that feed into the RL system later on. So I want to talk today about the situation this year in the wheat trials, which is obviously a reflection of what you've experienced on your farms throughout the country. So drilling and establishment of wheat this season and the issues we have had with that, current state of trials, the inspection and the validation, partly under the COVID restrictions, disease that we've seen and also that we've not seen, and sort of talk about a bit so what's coming next, what do we consider for next season and further down the line. So first start to talk a little bit about drilling dates of wheat this year and what the sort of effect that has on the RL and on trials. So on the left you see the UK map with all the RL and NL wheat locations, which is there's a large number of these trials. 2019 was a good entry for winter wheat for our trials, so everything got drilled in the exact, well, in the slots that we wanted it to. We normally have a small set that's very early sown, so sown before, some before the 15th of September and some before the 25th of September, and then we have the mid slot, which is in green, which is between the 26th of September and the 1st of November. And then we've got a late sown slot, so trials that we sow after sugar beet and some vegetable areas where we don't drill before November. Now, obviously, 2020 situation on the right, we can see that this is very different than normal. In the northeast, which is northeast of England and Scotland, trials were drilled later. You can see more blue. That's partly because we moved some of the early sown trials from the south that were not relevant anymore to the north, where this is still relevant practice. But in reality, the trials were drilled later there. The west, everything it looks like it's been drilled in the mid-slot, but it is later. The trials that we did try to drill in November and later actually failed or were eaten by slugs or sat in the wet. And then in the east, it's obviously the big change where the October drill trials moved into a lot of the October drill trials moved into November, and then the follow-up from that is that the late zone trials then have to be moved from November to even later, so they were drilled in January. So as a result, just on the right, we've got the winter wheat by region, the average days. It doesn't give the complete picture, so we'll focus on that a little bit more. But in the north, on average in the north, our trials were drilled about 7 days late. In the west, that went over to 2 weeks, and in the east, that went even up to like 4 weeks. And that's in part because if November drill trials move to January, that obviously creates a lot of extra days. So by region, you could see normally in the north, drilling is normally sort of the last part of September. This year, that moved into the first week of October mainly, and then the later drill trials into the later parts of October, but still all in that mid slot. But we've got these trials that are always drilled early there now. In the west, the trials are normally drilled the first 2 weeks of October, most of them anyway. That now moved into the last 2 weeks of October. Actually, there is a bar here that says trials in the first 2 weeks of November. They actually all fell into those last 4 days of October, so they were pretty much all in October. And these trials actually are no longer going because they were abandoned. So in the east, we always have a more varied sowing range because we've got early sown and late sowing and the normal slot. But this year, that's been extended with trials drilled in every month from mid-September to end of January. And then this is with the west. This is mainly where we've seen the problems with establishment in our trials on the good heavy land, silty land, clay land, and medium heavy land. That's where we've seen the establishment issues with the prolonged rain, where trials that are normally drilled earlier in October sort of were drilled later on. So this is where a lot of the problem trials are. And then this area is where trials were drilled in January. And we'll see in a minute that some of these are okay, but some of these have problems now, different problems. So this is probably what you've been seeing around the country. Things that were drilled early on look pretty good, apart from obviously in certain places, drought stress, but nice even establishment. As you can see, good plots. This is from our current trials. So when we move to late October, November drill trials, obviously with trial drills even being more limited than your big farm drills, we run into issues in our plots, and that has quite big consequences. Obviously, we see things like block coulters, plot trials sitting in water, and that leads to plots with big caps that are not comparable to other good plots. So either these plots need to come out, or the trial needs to be abandoned, or we sometimes can shorten plots. So this is why we have to see every trial to make sure that that is all scored correctly and that we use the correct plots. Then for the late January trials, they had very good establishment, so we had very good emergence. We had water in February, that was all good, but then it got dry, and on some sites it's held up okay and it's still okay, but on other sites, like here, the tillering has been very thin, so the yield potential is very low, and we need to make a decision later on whether this data is actually usable. Now for the RL, consequences of a lot of late drill trials is that late drill trials tend to produce lower yields, but they're still comparable. That's not necessarily an issue, but one of the concerns is, well, not a concern, they normally get less disease and they also get less lodging, so we might get less differential between varieties for those characters. As you can see, success rates, that is about numbers of trials. In 2019, we managed to get data from about 94% of the trials, which is sort of similar to our 5-year average, I guess. In 2020, we've already lost 20% of the trials either not drilled or abandoned, and then another 10% is probably of concern, and some because of drought might still be more. Now, as you saw, we've run lots of RL trials and NL trials, so I'm not too concerned about the RL position on this. It's an overyeared set, and we run a lot of numbers with a number of very good trials as well this year. Where there is slightly more concern is the NL set, because that obviously feeds into the RL. So that's a smaller number of trials with a higher, that are mainly drilled, where a large group is actually drilled in that area where we saw the problems. So we'll get less data for new varieties. So that's obviously becoming a higher risk of choosing new varieties. And it's obviously more tricky to then have make good decisions on candidate varieties next season. So at the moment we're doing our inspections. These are from trials around the country that we've already been looking at. So just to explain, so as one of my roles is trial inspector, I will, me and my 2 colleagues will see every one of these sites. So these are all the NL and RL sites in the UK, plus the one in Southern Ireland. And we will normally visit all these sites, and we will give every plot an overall plot score. And this really helps us at validation time, because we can, it gives us a really good picture of what's usable for the RL if there's a strange harvest results. So we score every individual plot on all the site. Now this year, obviously with the COVID restrictions, we've only been able to do day trips. So we've covered all the main sites already. These are all smaller trials. For Scotland, Northern Ireland and the Southwest, we will probably have to rely on our experienced operators doing these scores for us. They know how we score, because we send them all our reports. We have explained to them how we score. So we would like them to score. If we can still go, or if we can do it by video in the field, then we may look at that as well. But the fortunate thing is that most of the trials had pretty good reports for those areas earlier in the season. So not as many problems as we had in the East and Central and South. So hopefully that, we're fairly confident at the moment that we can deal with it this way and still get good trial data. So observation for trial inspection. So the main thing is obviously looking at the establishment of the trials. Are the trials good enough to actually compare varieties to each other? And then looking at what we see in the trials is that the main Septoria and brown rust has been very low until now, and if there wasn't any yellow rust, your untreated plots looked extremely clean. But in many areas there was yellow rust around. It's been in some areas, it's been in since very early from the season and still going with multiple infection timings. We are going to talk a lot about yellow rust later in this. Catherine will talk about the ratings. I will talk about more observations. We've also seen, and we've had reports of some sterility in wheat and barley, especially on lighter and brushy soils. This is normally caused by sort of late frost, sort of booting time. So this can be scored. We'll see if we need to take out areas, but sterility is, when we score sterility in the north of Scotland, this is varietal, so you might be able to get some data from that as well. And then I just want to warn people, because there's still a lot of green area left on the leaves if you haven't had a lot of yellow rust. The potential of late disease buildup. We don't have the background that we had last year of Septoria, but we had, last year we had some T3 slightly delayed by a few days because of the wet and windy weather sort of around cereals timing in Lincolnshire and Yorkshire, and the late Septoria built up very rapidly, was actually affecting the treated trials after the sort of fungicide programs finished working. So a variety with good Septoria resistance would have benefited there. This year, obviously, we have had dried and wet and now hot temperatures again. We could see something similar in certain areas with brown rust as well. So talk about yellow rust. So these are observations that I've done. So when I do my inspections, I always do the inspection and then I go past the untreated replicate and look past every plot for one replicate and sort of score it to help me with what I normally have my open days when I do my crop tours to help me understand which varieties are doing well and poorly. So I want to share some of this with you. So this is these don't mind the scores themselves. It's the pattern that we're looking at here. So when I've inspected these sites, or my colleagues have in Norfolk, Suffolk, Lincolnshire, North Lincolnshire, Teesside, and then later on in the West region, South and West, we've been picking up trials where yellow rust was present, and we've done a quick visual score. So these are not ratings; these are my personal observations that I've done in trials. I normally don't talk about individual varieties, but because I don't do open days this year, because I talk about them in the open days. But the pattern has been very consistent where there is yellow rust. So there's a group of varieties that have always got pretty high pressure, a group that have moderate levels, sometimes higher, then a group where you sometimes see a few, well, you see some spots, but it's dealing with it quite well. And then there's a small group that pretty much we are very surprised if we even see one stripe. We see the same further south. Now in Hampshire, where we were last week, all the yellow rust is fresh. It's coming 2 months later than in the trials on the left in the West region, but the pattern is exactly the same. So we're seeing very consistent varietal differences in the trial. So hopefully that will aid us with getting the ratings correct. So I normally don't talk about varieties, as I said, but I have sort of grouped them because I normally do this in my open days. I would talk about varieties, and we don't have a chance to do that this year. These are not ratings again. I've just grouped them in what I've observed in the trial, so that the most susceptible, some of you know anyway. So there's a group that we tend to see in most areas, yellow rust now, that is the group on the left. Then there's a group of quite popular varieties that we see moderate levels now, and on some of them distinctly more than in previous years, but still manageable at the moment. But there are some varieties in there that I think that the rating could come down. And then we've got the groups on the right, which are the sort of the resistant varieties. So what I've called the holding up well ones are varieties where I see single stripes sort of dotted around the plot a few times, but the varieties deal with it quite well at the moment. I know there are reports of some of these varieties with worse yellow rust, but consistently in the trials, they are behaving quite well. And then on the right, I have varieties that have performed exceptionally well against yellow rust. And it's quite interesting, actually, a number of varieties also have very good septoria resistance, and it also includes all the current group 2s in trial. So what next? So we're dealing with changing weather patterns. So what do we need to look out for? Like 3 of the last 4 seasons, all with the more extreme weather conditions, including a very long dry spell. On more and more sites in the east, yellow rust causes the biggest yield losses in the untreated trials. So extreme, because it comes in so earlier than the septoria. It basically wipes out a lot of the plots in the untreated trials. So it's very, it's still obviously fairly simple to treat if you're on time, but if you miss it, it will cause serious yield losses, obviously. And it is becoming more and more prevalent everywhere. But good resistance to septoria triticide remains an important management tool. The RL is now got a really good range of septoria ratings with the septoria assessments improving. There's very good differences, and they look very much as we see in the field. Obviously, where possible, make use of varieties with specific traits for pest resistance. Resistance to pests, so like orange beet blossom itch resistant varieties, where that is relevant. One of the new things that we're seeing coming through the NL and RL system is BYDV resistance. So we're obviously keen to get that on the list. Still, don't focus just on that, because obviously you need to look at the other characters does that variety also have good other disease resistances? If you're in the east, you might wonder, does it actually have the orange? Am I swapping BYD or orange root blossom resistance for BYDV resistance? For the next few years, you might see hybrid wheat in RL trials, but not next year. So it could be, but it is sort of looking more likely that we'll see those back in trial, back in the RL trials. And then my view for this year is, given the fact that late disease, changing diseases, the saying, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. If you have a variety that works well for you, and you're thinking about new varieties that is not too much data of, might consider not changing and sticking with this. If you do need to change, obviously look at what are the fields around you, look at varieties with your colleagues, and check out a variety selection tool, which will help you decide as well. Fewer NL trials mean, as I said, less varieties about less information about new varieties. Yeah, the risk is just higher for choosing a new variety, so you need to really need a new variety to change. So I've gone. So Rose, did you?
No, you're all right, Mark.
Okay.
Sorry. Do you want to, just skip through these and
yeah,
highlight the tool?
Okay, so I'm running out of time, but I've gone through the variety. I've used the variety selection tool here, so where I basically go by region and I choose whatever is suitable. So I've highlighted yields in the north. You can highlight your yields either UK or by region. The agronomic merit is a mixture of disease and lodging resistance for that important for that region, and then you can select. So here for the north, I've selected soft weeds with 5.5 for mildew, because that's an important disease in the north. Yellow rust, okay, and maturity max 1, and then you can see what your options are from barrel and Viscount that are widely grown. Skyscraper you should look at that on lighter land. If you want a replacement for your Viscount, you should look at what the characters of these are, with illicit also being a biscuit variety. You'll have to stop me, Rose, when I run out of time. But
thank you very much, Mark. I think it really is enlightening to see how much work goes into the recommended list, beyond just that booklet that we all pick up at the open days. The variety selection tool, there is actually a webinar that was put together about a month ago, available online if anybody wants to look at that and see how it does work. But it really is useful if you are thinking about specific objectives that Mark's mentioned earlier, and want to pull out any varieties that would suit you and your farming situation. So we do, at the end of this webinar, there is a page of resources. So if you don't find it on the website, then you can click through there to suss out using the tool. Just a quick question, Mark, if that's all right, before we pass over to Catherine. And I think, the question is, what's the best feed varieties for continuous wheat in Northern Ireland, bearing in mind high septoria risk? Which, for 2 pennies, have a look at the selection tool. But I'm really intrigued as to what work is being done regards continuous wheat, or not so much so now.
No, we don't have currently any continuous wheat in our system. So we run a number of specific second wheat trials, but we don't go into continuous wheat. So that I can't give you any new data on continuous wheat. Obviously, look, for Northern Ireland, the focus is completely on septoria, and obviously if continuous, then the take-all risk diminishes again in the later years. So it's focus on the septoria ratings and standing power, I would say.
Yeah, no, that's great, thank you. And just another really quick one, I think, bearing in mind that Skyfall is about the #1 variety grown in the UK at the minute, are you seeing many new varieties come into trial that look like a possible replacement for it? what are
Yeah,
breeders' objectives?
yeah, I saw that. I've had that question before. It depends a bit on what you grow Skyfall for, obviously, because Skyfall's grown in so many different guises, being a Group 1. If it's grown as a bred variety, there's no new Group 1 candidate, and so that would be at least 2 years before it be another new bred variety on the RL. So from that point of view, no. If it's grown as a variety with many options, because as a feed, because it fits in many slots, and because it is fairly decent at many things, including the midge resistance, then it's quite difficult, because it was obviously one of the things that was really good about it. Actually, one of the varieties that should have taken some of that market would be Zayat, the other Group 1, because it's in many ways it's very similar, apart from the midge resistance and the very late drilling, and slightly better at others. So Xstays fills some of these things, but it's not as flexible. So and it doesn't have the midge resistance. Obviously, very good disease resistance. So I think Xstays will fill some of it, but isn't as flexible. Currently, a variety that does well as a feed, and especially also as a second wheat, where Skyfall has grown a lot, is a feed variety, and it's Gleam, and that's another variety that has a lot of good characters, performs consistently well in many of our trials, early, mid, late, first and second wheat, and it's got decent overall disease resistance, although we are seeing more yellow rust in that as well, but not as much as Skyfall.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Mark. Right, there's a whole host of questions coming in about varieties, but we will
Yes.
pass over. We'll give you a chance to have a quick breather, and we'll pass over to Catherine first. Before Catherine kicks off, I do believe we've got a poll to start with here. So I will just give you a minute or two to answer this, but have you seen unexpected levels of yellow rust in resistant varieties this year? Yes, no, or not sure. Have you seen unexpected levels of yellow rust in resistant varieties this year? And I think following on from what Mark was saying earlier, there's certainly a lot of action going on in the field at the minute. Right, hopefully you've all had a chance to look at that. So have you seen unexpected levels of yellow rust in resistant varieties this year? 37% of you are saying yes, 41% no, and 22% not sure. Catherine, are you seeing similar things in the field as well? What do you make of that much?
Yeah, well, it's just as we expect, really. I've not had a chance to be out in the field this year, but Mark's been out, and as he's just outlined, he's seen a few changes. So yeah, I'm going to talk through it now.
Thank you.
Start, right?
Yeah, go for it. Thank you.
So my name is Catherine Harries, and I manage disease work at AHDB. So I do the recommended list disease ratings. And today I'm going to talk to you about the yellow rust and brown rust ratings, the changes we've seen in recent years, and the changes we've got to come. So as I'm sure we've all seen, the rust populations are on the move and causing high levels of disease in varieties that were previously resistant. And this is known as the varieties breaking down to disease. So for yellow rust, this has been ever since the incursion of the warrior population in 2011, when the population started becoming more and more diverse. These changes in the pathogen population are monitored by the United Kingdom Cereal Pathogen Virulence Survey, or the UK CPVS. And that means we're able to work out what new races are in the UK, what varieties they're likely to affect, and how the different races are genetically different or genetically linked. So these charts show the change in the genetic makeup of the yellow rust population since 2015. So yellow rust genetic groups are labelled with different colours, and we can see that in 2015 there was a good mix of the different genetic groups. But this has quite quickly changed, so the population is now dominated by the red genetic group. And these colour groupings show how they're genetically related, but it doesn't necessarily show what varieties they'll infect. And we know that the red group of isolates infects a broad range of varieties. So that's what the UK CPVS goes on to do, test which varieties these new isolates infect. We're also seeing new races in the brown rust population. So this pie chart shows how there were more new pathotypes than existing pathotypes detected in 2019. So for yellow rust, we can see these changes if we look at the levels of yellow rust in different varieties since 2010. So this chart, up the side, it shows how variable varieties are compared to each other in each year. And along the bottom, it shows the average amount of disease in each year. And that's not on a percentage scale, so don't worry about the numbers. So we can see that before 2016, most varieties were quite resistant and had relatively low levels of disease, and they all performed quite similar to each other. But in 2016 and after, varieties are tending to have more disease, and there's a big range in susceptibilities between varieties. So that's just quite a nice way to show how the change since 2016. We know that varieties have different levels of resistance to yellow rust at the seedling stage. So that's any time before the flag leaf emerges, and at the adult stage. So that's any time after the flag leaf's emerged. And most varieties are actually susceptible at the seedling stage. So in this year's recommended list, just 8 out of the 35 winter wheat varieties on the list are resistant at the seedling stage, and then a further 14 are resistant at the adult stage. So this means that seeing yellow rust before the flag leaf has emerged doesn't necessarily mean the variety is broken down to the disease, but because of the uncertainty, you should always control these rusts if you see them and don't rely on the varietal resistance. So my job is to make sure the disease ratings in the RL are useful and relevant for growers, including making sure they reflect what's seen in the field. And we recognise at the moment the ratings don't always reflect what's seen in the field, and that's why we're working to improve this. So whilst we're not able to predict what races there are going to be in the following season or what changes to varietal resistance there'll be, we can do better by getting the ratings to better represent what was seen in the field in the previous season. So previously, for example, in 2016, when we've had substantial race changes, we've calculated ratings based on just the most recent season's data, so using 1 rather than 3 years of data. But now that the rust population is so variable, it seems like there's going to be big changes every year, and using 1 year of data every year is not a good way to calculate the ratings. In 2019, there were reports of higher than expected levels of yellow and brown rust in some varieties with good resistance ratings. So, for example, there were reports of KW Hasayat getting more yellow rust than expected, and the UK CPVS received a lot of samples from this variety. But the data we got from the recommended list trials showed that this change wasn't consistent or widespread across the country. So in 2019, we used the last 3 years of data to calculate the ratings, and including a cautionary box around the ratings, noting the uncertainty we had seen from some trials. So KW Zayat ended up just dropping by 1 point, and so did Bennington and Viscount, so that's for yellow rust. And for brown rust, we just had one major change really in KWS Firefly, where the brown rust rating dropped by 2. But it could be argued that this rating really should have dropped by more, considering the disease levels we saw last year. So clearly, just putting a box around these ratings isn't a long-term solution, and we need the ratings to reflect the current population as much as possible every year. And this is especially important this year with the changes we've seen that Mark outlined. And he suggested that maybe the changes are a bit more consistent across the country this year than they were last year. But we won't know the extent of these changes until we analyse the data over the summer. But the UK CPBS has received a good number of samples this year, so thank you to everyone who sent them in. And it's not too late to send more samples in. So if you see yellow or brown rust in a variety with a high disease rating, please do send in a sample. And the sampling instructions are attached as a handout to this webinar, if you can find the handout section. So because we're seeing this continued change and spread of new races, we've looked at a few options as to how we can make the RL ratings more representative and useful. And with this, we're aiming to show the stability of ratings so that growers are able to choose the most low-risk varieties. So some, but by no means all, of the options we've looked at are showing the trend in a variety's disease level over time. So looking at if disease levels are gradually going up or gradually going down, or maybe even suddenly going up or down, and being aware that varieties so race changes can actually cause varieties to become less susceptible and more resistant to the overall yellow rust population. We've also looked at using ratings where the most recent year of data has a higher weighting than the data from the previous 2 years. And this would mean that the most recent year has a higher influence on the overall rating that we get out of it. We've looked at doing a worst case scenario rating alongside the normal rating, and that will show if the varieties perform badly in any of the trials in that year. And this was actually done many years ago, I believe, in the RL, using artificially inoculated trials in a polytunnel. So we're looking at something possibly similar to that. We could also use footnotes on the list to highlight varieties we're concerned about, using evidence from the UK CPBS tests. And then something we'll definitely be doing is running extra diagnostics every year, in consultation with our statisticians to see, to pick out any varieties or trials that are performing oddly, to understand what's going on in the population. And this graph is, you can see here, this colourful graph is just an example of one of the diagnostics we're going to be using. I won't attempt to explain it though today. So that's some of the potential changes in the pipeline, but yeah, we'll wait till we've analysed this year's data before any firm decisions, so watch this space. So finally, I'm just going to take you through some of the other improvements in the RL ratings that have been going on recently. So improvements to the septoria ratings. We noticed a few years ago that the yellow rust and septoria ratings were starting to align with each other, so they were starting to sort of correlate and give similar numbers. And this picture really shows why we were seeing this. When yellow rust has died off, from a first glance, it can look very much like septoria. So this picture here is not, there's not any substantial septoria here. This is all yellow rust that's died off. But you can imagine if a trial operator comes to this, you know, you sort of almost assume it was septoria. So what has been happening is some assessments that we thought were for septoria were actually assessing yellow rust. So what we've done to try and improve this, we've done some extra training with trial operators to make sure they only assess the disease if they're sure it's that disease. So that means only assessing yellow rust if you can see the pustules, so the characteristic yellow blobs, and only assessing the disease as septoria if you can definitely see the pycnidia, so the little small black spots. and this has improved things dramatically, which is really good news. And we've also been running extra checks on the data to make sure we don't include any assessments that might not properly represent the target disease. We've also been trying to avoid a mix of diseases in trials, which can cause problems when assessing. So, for example, we've been spraying some trials to control yellow rust, so that we're able to get good septoria data with no yellow rust complicating the assessments. And with all these improvements, I'm now 100% confident that the septoria ratings accurately reflect septoria resistance and what you can see in the field. So that's really good news. And if you want to learn more about disease assessing and how to distinguish between septoria and yellow rust and different levels of disease, then there's a session in the webinar from early June from the Strategic Farm webinars. So please go to the AHDB Cereals and Oilseeds YouTube channel to find out. Okay, that's me. Thank you. I'll take questions at the end, I think.
Thank you very much, Catherine. That was absolutely wonderful. We've had quite a few questions in actually about yellow rust ratings and how they're changing, and also explaining how disease scores are calculated. So fingers crossed. I mean, you did in my mind without a doubt that you've covered those. So without further ado, again, I'll pass over to Ellie. We'll bring some questions up at the end for you, but I'll hand over to Ellie now. Thank you very much.
Okay. So good morning, everyone. I'm going to give an overview on the AHDB harvest results today, and also one of our new digital tools, which is the RL app. So me and my team are responsible for the analysis of all of the recommended list data, and this also involves the publication of the data. So across all crops, the RL project supports around 200 fungicide treated and untreated yield trials each year. So once all of these harvest results have been received from the trial operators, we aim to make these results available to the industry as soon as possible. But there is quite a lot of preparation which goes into producing these results before we're able to share these with you. So all of our trials are scrutinised by experts throughout the year. This happens through trial inspections by AHDB staff, trial maintenance and data collection by our trial operators, and also a statistical and technical validation of the results. And this is all to ensure that we publish the most reliable data to the industry. So, as Mark mentioned, in a normal year, all of the RL yield trials are inspected by our team of technical experts. So they're out on the road at the moment trying to get to each of these trial sites. So once there, they're inspecting each of the plots and they're assessing the effectiveness of any fungicides, PGRs, fertilizer applications, uniformity of the trial. So really, essentially, they're trying to ensure that the trials are fit for purpose and they're likely to generate good data for the RL purposes. So also throughout the growing season, we're in constant communication with all of our trial operators across the UK. So they're the ones who are responsible for the day-to-day management of the trial and also the assessments. And they are submitting data to our team of analysts throughout the year. So initially, they're providing information about the trial site and then also plot assessments such as establishment or pest damage. And this information throughout the year allows us to build a picture of all of our trial sites and how each crop is progressing. So finally, we receive the harvest data, and samples are also collected from each of the plots and sent to specialist testing labs across to assess the grain quality. So all of these results, so from the plot information, the disease data, the harvest data, and also the quality, are made available through the Harvest Results Service in the summer. So once we receive the trial harvest data, our technical experts, so Mark and his team, will be reviewing the yield data and assessing it for inconsistencies and irregularities from what's been observed in the field. So to do this, they're using information from their inspections and also the early data and communication that we've had with the trial operators throughout the year. So we also perform statistical validations for each of the trials. And to do this, we perform two types of analysis. So firstly, we run a within trial analysis. And this is to assess the variability of the data between each plot of the trial. And then we also run an over trials analysis. And this is where we're comparing the results for the trial as a whole with the other yield trials for the crop. And this really allows us to see if the trial is performing consistently with other similar trials. And it can also help us to pick out if there's any regional trends as well. So there can be occasions where we receive trial data and it can look unusual compared to other trials. So the validation of these trials can sometimes be delayed, as we need to make sure that the data presented is actually a true reflection of the trial and that the varieties in that trial are performing to the best of their potential. So these trials are only validated once we've given them a further statistical or technical investigation. And the validators really need to be satisfied that these results are a true representation of how the varieties are performing under the specific trial conditions. So this whole validation step is really important, as it ensures that we're only using reliable data for the RL and that the trials really do represent a fair test of the varieties. So once the trials have been validated, that's when we're able to publish the data to you through the Harvest Results Service. So the Harvest Results Service can be found on our website, and a list of links will be sent around later. And once you're here, you'll find the following links for each crop. So we present the Harvest Results file, which presents all of the valid trial data for each trial. And then we also have a slimmed down file, which is just the yield results, which has yield data only. On this page as well, you also see the information about the recommended list trial sites and locations, and also the sowing list, so you can see which varieties are in trial for each crop. So those are actually available for each of the crops on the website at the moment. So the yield trials are presented as both the raw data in tonnes per hectare and also a percentage of the control varieties. So to do this, a range of established varieties are selected as controls, and these are set to 100%. So here we can see that in 2019, the mean of the control varieties is 11.3. This is then the 100% figure. So then if we look at the 2019 values, we can see that varieties which have over 100% reported are those which are performing better than the control varieties, and those which are reported as under 100% are performing worse than the controls. And this really helps us to give comparisons across different sites. I will say that it's really important that results from individual trial sites are not fully used to make conclusions on variety performance. For the RL data sets, we actually use a 5 years worth of data to make our decisions. So it's really important also the season and location is taken into consideration. And we update these harvest results on a weekly basis, if not more, as the new results come in. So the majority of the data presented in the harvest results is for the current year's trials, but also the over years average is a really important thing to look at, and we present this for the yield data. So we present a 5-year average for the cereal crops and a 4-year average for the oilseeds. And these averages can be used to provide better information for comparison between the varieties. So as I said, as more information becomes available from the current year's harvest, this contributes to the average. So it's really important to keep checking these results. So to help you keep up to date, we send an email to users who are subscribed to the Harvest Results Service. And this is updated and sent out when we have updated results and analysis on the website. So the details are there if you want to subscribe to the Harvest Results email. So the next thing I want to update you on is the newest release for the RL. So as Paul mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, the RL has been undergoing a bit of a digital revolution lately, starting with the variety selection tools, which were launched back in December. And I'm now really pleased to let you all know that last week we launched the Recommended List app. So the app is an evolution of the RL pocketbooks. So you might have picked these up at open days and events throughout the summer. But now all of that information is available as a phone app. So instead of carrying around all of these books, you can download all of the information into your mobile device. So the app is available on both the Android and Apple platforms. So if you want to head over to the Google Play or Apple app stores and search Recommended Lists, you should be able to download it, and I'll give you a short demo in a moment. So whilst you're doing that, just a little bit more background information about the app. So it covers all recommended, described and candidate varieties, so all of the crops that we currently have in trial. It is free to download. One of the really important things that we designed it to be is that it will work offline. So if you only need to have internet access to be able to download it onto your phone and then to push through any updates. But once it's downloaded, if you're out in the fields, you want to check something but you don't have any signal, the app will still work. And what I'm going to do now is hopefully play a little demo of some of the main features of the app for you to have a look at. So when you open the Recommended List app, you'll be taken to the home screen. On this screen, you'll be presented with tiles for each of the recommended and described crops. So from here, you're then able to navigate your way to the variety of interest. So let's have a look at the wheat section. So once you select the crop tile, you're taken to a set of menus, and from here you can navigate through the recommended or candidate varieties, then the variety type, until you find your variety of choice. We're then able to select a name, and we're taken to the data for that variety. So at the top of the page, we've got the headline information and also the breeder contact details. As we scroll down, we get the data tables as well. So these tables are also collapsible, so if you need to make a bit more space on the screen, then you can do that. And if we scroll to the bottom of the page, we see if there's any relevant notes about the variety. So here we have a note about a particular disease aspect, and as it's a quality wheat, we also have a comment from NABIM. So as I mentioned before, this app replaces the RL pocketbook publications, but we've been really keen to make sure that you're able to use the app in the same way that you might have used the pocketbooks. So in the hard copy pocketbooks, you might have wanted to highlight key information, scribble down some notes about a variety, or even bookmark some of your favourite varieties. So you can do all of this on the app too. So to highlight a row of interest, simply tap the row and it turns green. Then when you come back to this page in the future, this row of particular interest will remain highlighted. If you want to add a note to the page, you can scroll down to the bottom and hit Add Note. You can type in your note in the box and save it, and it gets saved down here at the bottom with a date stamp. So you can also go back into the note to edit it just by tapping on it and then saving it again. And if you no longer need the note, you can delete it by just pressing the trash can there. So, and finally, if you have a variety which you want to keep coming back to, you can add this to your favourites list. So this might be like folding down a corner of a page in your pocketbook. So to do this, simply scroll to the top of the page and hit Add to Favourites. Once you've done this, you'll notice a green star at the top right of the page and a 1 has been added to this favourite star at the bottom. So if we head over to the favourites area, we'll see that KWS Sciat appears here along with all of the other varieties I have saved in my favourites. So this means the next time you enter the app, you can head straight for the favourites section and then straight to your variety of choice without having to navigate through too many menus. There's various ways you can sort varieties on this page, so either by date added, A to Z, or by the crop. And if you want to remove a variety from this list, simply swipe left and hit unmark. So the other way to find your variety of interest is through the search function. And there's 2 ways to use this function, either by scrolling through the varieties for each crop or by typing in the name of your variety in the search box. So the final function I want to highlight is the automatic updates. One of the limitations of the printed pocketbooks is that some data can quickly become out of date. And this happens in candidate varieties, where we're only able to publish the data for each variety once that variety has been added to the national list. So if we have a look at one of the wheat candidates, we have SY Clipper here, which has not yet been added to the NL, and so we can't publish the data. And we see this little label here, which you might be familiar with from the printed pocketbooks. However, with the app, as soon as we have the notification that the variety has been added to the NL, we can push through an update. So you will always have the most up-to-date information. This will happen silently when you open the app, so you won't get bombarded with lots of notifications every time this happens. So the app will also have a major update annually around January time after the new recommended list is released. So you'll receive a notification when the app is ready for this major update. And once complete, the year at the top of the home screen will also update, so it's very clear as to which year's data you're viewing. Okay, so I hope you found that useful, and I hope you're able to download the app and also find that useful when you're out and about looking at varieties as well. So just one last thing I wanted to flag up is something else you might have been picking up at the summer events is the summer edition of the recommended list booklet. This is still available even though we're not out at events. So if you do want to get hold of a copy, you can either download it from the website or order a printed publication. The summer edition has additional variety comments and also updated candidate information. So
Ellie, that's absolutely brilliant. Thank you very much. And just before you disappear and while everybody else switches their cameras back on, I think you really have highlighted the data that is collected that goes into the recommended list. It's unbelievable. And I don't know, for those of you that are on Twitter, you'll have seen yesterday that Paul Temple, our board chair, was visiting an RL trial site looking at the varieties and using the app very successfully himself. But just out of interest, is there any way, all of you sort of talked about the importance of the 5-year data and looking back at what's previously happened, but can we look back at the previous RL data on the app as well?
Yeah, so you can do that from the home screen. So when you're on the home screen, you just sort of swipe up slightly, and then there's a link at the bottom which can take you to the previous data on the website. So yeah, that is accessible through the app as well.
Brilliant, thank you very much. So I'm just a few questions. I am conscious that we're slightly running over time. So if we have a look at these. But Mark, probably one for you again, and going back to regional data, would it be possible to grow any Group 1s in Scotland at all? And I think bearing in mind the sterility issues, are there any available varieties?
We do some sterility work, but it's not extensive. So for the group ones, Skyfall has probably got the lowest number, and it sort of sits between sterility levels of popular varieties like Barrel and Viscount, and so in most cases that should be okay. It's more protein levels normally in further north that are the issue. The most natural bread making variety for protein levels is Crusoe, and again that's sort of medium levels for sterility from the limited data that we have, but it's still in a similar range as varieties that were widely grown in the north, like Viscount. So they're not extremely varieties known for sterility. They do get some, but the group 2 that actually got the group 2 variety that might be considered is an established variety, is actually KWS Lily, which is one of the varieties that generally tends to get one of the lowest scores in sterility work. So yeah, group 1s, from our data, Skyfall would be the best option, but Crusoe is probably also okay, and Detroit as a group 2 potentially. But yeah, we're slightly concerned. We've only got very little data about, for instance, Xtase, but we're slightly concerned about that. We are concerned about that, and yeah, Zayed's numbers aren't that great either.
Okay, thank you. And just following on from that, with the extreme weather conditions, do you think this will affect how far north the data will show?
I don't know. I mean, the extreme weather conditions are partly actually sort of the east becoming more arid, and the better growing conditions moving sort of towards the Humber, Yorkshire, South Scotland. So whether you actually get more sterility in that area is debatable. Obviously, the extreme weather condition is a late frost for sterility in general. So yeah, that is hard for me to predict. That it could actually become less in southern parts of Scotland because it's getting sort of slightly warmer and less risk of frosts. Most of the sterility testing that we do is sort of really in the north of Scotland at the moment.
Brilliant, thank you. Catherine, just one for you. I don't know, probably a comment and thought process as much as anything, but why don't we see the same pressure of septoria in the field compared to what you're seeing in trials?
I don't know if that comment's related to lower or higher pressure, but we do. We place our disease recommended list trials in areas of high septoria. So, for example, we've got a trial in Ireland that's really good for collecting septoria data. So obviously that's much higher pressure than in most of the UK. And we have trials in Cornwall and Devon and in the West. So they're all aimed at high septoria levels. So that should account for most of the difference. But we're targeting for it. We want to get good data, and we can do that by getting sites with high disease levels and high disease pressure.
It's obviously completely untreated, no fungicide whatsoever.
Yeah.
So. Yeah.
So yeah, you'd have to compare your untreated crop, if no T0, T1, T2, anything, so that your fungicides are obviously going to have an impact on the disease level.
And coming at it from a slightly different angle, different question, do you look at tillering and shoot survival at all in these varieties?
We do currently not look at tillering. It's very hard to do within the RL. It might be done within AHDB. We are talking about that. Shoot survival is more to do with sort of the establishment scores that people do, that our operators do in the winter, and then another one in the spring. So we do look at sort of winter hardiness type scores. So that is recorded in all our trials. We just don't have a rating for it at the moment.
So hopefully see that going forwards. Thank you. Ellie, following on about your app, can the app show sowing dates, i.e. the latest safe sowing date?
Yeah, so it doesn't show that at the moment, and that is information that we have in the main booklet for winter wheat. So when we put the app together, we based it on the old pocketbook publications and kept the same characters that we had in that. But actually going forward, there's no reason why we can't add in additional characters such as latest safe sowing date. So we are looking for feedback on the app, and if there are characters such as that or any other additional characters that you would like to see, yeah, we can do that in a future update.
Brilliant, thank you. So we'll leave the questions there. There are a few more to go through without a doubt, but we're running over a time, and I'm sure all of you are fit for another cup of tea. So if we just skip on a slide, please, Ellie, just highlighting again the resources that are available within AHDB. If you don't click on any of these links, they'll show up again if you follow the YouTube channel or head straight to our website and have a look there. But like any of these things, if you get stuck or aren't sure, you know, my email address is at the bottom. Please feel free to get in touch with me or any of the other team, and we will help you. It has been a very funny year without a doubt, and it's a huge shame to not be looking at any of the trials. They all do look absolutely wonderful at this time of year, and there's so much effort goes into them. But, you know, I'd like to thank Catherine, Paul, Ellie and Mark for talking through what they do and the importance of the data and the information that goes into making the recommended list. So if we skip on one more, just to close, there will be a survey follow through, and like Ellie's just said, your feedback is always really very valuable and much appreciated. It's the first time we've really had to get going with this digital platform, and we want to continue it and continue it as well as possible. So feedback's always very appreciated. This session has been recorded, like I mentioned, so if you want to go back and look at it, please do. And if you've got any questions, you know, again, do get in touch with me. And I think just to highlight and mention the next webinar, we've got pre-harvest preparations on the 1st of July. That is available. The link is on our website, AHDB events page. Everything's on there, to be honest. So have a look. There's all sorts going on. And just also to mention, I'm sure most of you realise that this webinar is part of a two-parter today. So we've kicked off with the recommended list and focusing on the wheats this morning, and then this evening at 7 o'clock we're looking at the barleys and oilseed rapes. So I hope you can join us again later on, but thank you all very much for joining us. I hope you've gleaned as much out of it as what I have, and seen the intensity of work that goes into the recommended list and what the team do. But thank you all again for joining us, Catherine, Mark, Ellie. Thank you very much indeed. So we will see you later on at 7 o'clock. Thank you.
Thank you.